So, welcome to the Advanced Patient Care, a podcast series by Vance Thompson Vision. Today's podcast is featuring all things research, and I'll be your host today, Dr. Kayla Karpuk. I'm an optometrist in the Sioux Falls, South Dakota location, who gets to lead our research team here. This podcast is here to bring you the latest advancements, cutting-edge research, and practical tips that you can apply to your clinical practice right away. So, if you're ready to expand your knowledge, stay ahead of the curve, and elevate your practice, you're in the right place. And I'll introduce our guests here today. We have Dr. Seth Stoffren.
Seth Stoffren. I'm one of the optometrists here in Fargo at Vance Thompson Vision. I've been here for about 3 years now. I can no longer say that I'm the youngest doctor at Vance Thompson Vision, but I'm pretty close.
How does that make you feel? Do you wish you could still say you were the youngest doctor at Vance Thompson Vision?
I'm a little indifferent about it. I get told every single day that I look like I just graduated high school by every single patient I see. So I still feel young.
And we also have Tiffany Facile, and I'll let her introduce herself.
Hi, I'm Tiffany Facile, and I have the pleasure of being the research director for 6 of our 7 clinical sites that conduct research. I have the pleasure of working with providers much like Dr. Karpuk, Dr. Stoffren, and those throughout our VTV family.
Awesome. Well, we're really excited for today's podcast. And so we'd like to take this podcast and kind of from a start to finish perspective, walk you through the research process. And of course, it's fun to be able to understand kind of the clinical aspect of it, but it's also important to not overlook some of the understanding the research studies that are published out there. So I think that's kind of where we'd like to start. And so when we are looking at published research, there's different things that we can kind of hone in on when we are reading through, such as, number of investigators, study design, what types of patients were included, were there pertinent patients that were excluded that is meaningful, and kind of going from there. And so Tiffany or Seth, talk me through a little bit about like multi-site versus single site or multiple investigators versus single investigators. Where are those, in looking at that, where is that helpful? Should we be eager to see multi-site data or single site? Tiffany, you want to take that away?
Yeah, thanks. So running clinical trials is not an easy feat. And so sometimes with clinical trials, it's really answering the study question. Is it a proof of concept? Is it safety of a device? Is it efficacy of a medication? And so there's a lot of thought that goes into a study design, as well as basic core statistics. So when you run a multi-site study, typically those are larger, what we say phase studies, meaning there's hundreds to thousands of participants, longer term study. And really the purpose of that is to hopefully get the drug or device approved for clinical use outside of a clinical trial. So when you kind of go back and reverse, you start an earlier phase study, generally with 1 or 2 investigators, a small number of patients. And the purpose of an earlier phase study is really safety. We have to make sure that patients are always protected, of course, and on a clinical trial, we take those things very seriously. We have to follow different regulations, including an ethics board review and determination. So we like to keep things very small to avoid any variables that might either skew the data, potentially cause confusion for the data, and we just need a very tight and controlled operations for that study. So again, it really depends on the purpose of the device or the drug, or really the study question that we're looking to answer, and then the process, if you will, of FDA approval, or perhaps just reviewing something that is generally more broad-based. So clearly, not a straight and linear pathway to developing the appropriate study, but certainly for those of us that have done research a long time, we understand the nuances and the intricacies that it takes to run a clinical trial. So whether we make our own or write our own clinical trial or follow someone else's, those are things that definitely we look towards when deciding to run the study.
Awesome, thank you. And you kind of touched on it a little bit, but I think we could definitely do a deeper dive, and maybe, quite honestly, we should have started here. There's two, I like to view it as two big types of studies. You either have FDA monitored or you have investigator initiated studies. And when we talk about particularly FDA studies, we're probably all familiar with reading, phase 1 versus phase 4. And like I said, you kind of had touched on it a little bit already, but I think it's worth going into the differences of each and where we participate, or maybe where somebody would be interested in starting to participate. So Seth, why don't you talk us through a little bit of those phases?
Sure. And kind of starting with what Tiffany had brushed on a little bit, just with phase 1 studies is going to be earlier on, and this is going to be talking mostly your FDA monitored trials, and that's typically looking at approval for new medication, approval for new device to treat a specific condition. And those earlier phases are going to be smaller scale, less participants, shorter windows. And again, you're looking mostly at safety, one, to make sure that the drug or the device is safe in itself, and then try to figure out the proper dosages that should be used for your specific population that you're targeting. You want to be able to figure out how to maximize your benefits of this treatment while reducing and limiting risk and side effects at the same time. So that first phase, you're looking for acute side effects. Is there a certain level of dosing that these side effects show up? And then you can kind of go around different routes of administration if that's on the table, whether it's oral administration, injection, inhalation. But for us in eye care, most of the time we're looking at eye drops, injectables, or device implantation. And then as we go across or move forward with different phases, they just get larger and oftentimes longer as well. So phase 2, you're looking at a larger scale. So that's when you get to several hundred participants. And then that window gets larger. So instead of it being, several months, you're potentially going up to multiple years, and you're still looking at safety for the most part, but now it's a larger window. So you're looking at longer ranges of your safety profile, and probably 70% of drugs make it to that phase 2. And then 33% of drugs in development make it to phase 3. And that's when you're really starting to look at the efficacy of the medication or the device that's being used. And then you're typically getting out to that, somewhere anywhere between 1 and 4 year windows for that phase 3. And that's when you're officially looking for FDA approval to try to get your drug back out, or initially out on the market. Then, beyond that, phase 4 is when it's post-approval. So you're looking at very long range for safety profile or extended efficacy, prove that this does not just last for 1 to 2 years, it's going to keep on working down the road. So a lot of companies will want that information so that they can prove and say, hey, this has been out for this long and it still works better than what's been out before.
Tiffany, do you find that a phase 4 study, from the FDA perspective, they're always asking for that, or are there certain instances where they might lean into that a little more than others?
That's a great question. So there's different divisions or entities within the FDA. And quite honestly, Dr. Karpuk, the FDA can require a post-approval study for devices post-approval. Some entities within the FDA, like the drug side, may not. So it really kind of depends on how the FDA will view the drug or device or study product, if you will, and understand if a long-term phase study is necessary. Sometimes they won't require post-approval data or study data, and sometimes they do. What's interesting, and this is probably another podcast in itself, but the entire world is actually looking at standardizing how we conduct clinical trials. And so there are international efforts being made to identify the number of safety data points and the number of efficacy data points that are required for approval. And with that said, I've started to notice a lot more long-term safety and efficacy studies being required, especially for device in ophthalmology. And those phase 4 studies can even last as long up to 3 years. And I do believe that is a initiative that came out of our European partners. So I trust that this topic of conversation will change over the next few years.
And I think it's important too to kind of take a step back and, what is research, or where is research helpful? Well, we know that research helps to advance treatment options. That's probably the obvious. Research certainly can help with patient access to treatment. I think all of us here could probably think of a patient or multiple patients who would benefit from being in research. Also, too, it is what helps with insurance reimbursements and or labeling. And that kind of brings me back to, that phase 4 study versus the phase 3 study. Where do you think, insurance companies are looking to for their data in terms of reimbursement?
Can you expand further on that, Dr. Karpuk? I want to make sure that I direct the answer appropriately.
So we know that research can be helpful in terms of advancing treatment options or patient access to care, but I think one that we maybe overlook is how it impacts insurance reimbursement.
So insurance reimbursement can be challenging, and really a lot of that work is done in tandem with the phase 3, phase 4 studies by the sponsors, meaning it's generally required for a new drug or device, especially device, that gets in the arms of our CMS group. So typically a sponsor will, what we say, apply for a code that is a billable code for insurance reimbursement. Certainly all of the data that is required goes into that application process to ensure that the drug or device is effective. And therefore, it's important to make sure the sponsors have the quality data, the clean study data, understands maybe the range and you highlighted this earlier, Dr. Karpuk, but really, what is the label of the drug or device? And if you have statistical significance to prove the safety and efficacy of that certainly achieves insurance approval. There are multiple pathways for something to get approved as well, and we won't go into that in great detail. But certainly these clinical trials attribute to approval in the hopes that our insurance providers find the safety and that efficacy value to achieve insurance approval.
And I think too, maybe there can be a phase 4 study or something thereof that helps to expand labeling. Is that true? And then would go back to insurance companies and reimbursement might look at that.
Absolutely. Initially, it's been fun over the years in healthcare to see different drugs or devices get approval for a specific indication, only to find out that the drug or device can be expanded, meaning that there is some signaling of efficacy outside of the product label, which, like you said, then would require a phase 4 type research study to evaluate that. So that's the fun of research, is that it never stops. It always continues, and our patients get access to those.
I don't know about you guys, but I'm feeling the more we're having this conversation, it feels like the wheels, we could just continue to go down this route and talk about this aspect of research, or decide to go down this. And I've got to remind myself, we only have a set period of time. But it's always fun to talk about, because I think that there's so much in research, especially clinical research, that maybe we as clinicians don't really have a great understanding of, because we don't do it all the time. Anyways, so I think that's always interesting. It's been great to hear about different phases of clinical research, but it takes money, not just time, to get these research clinical trials off the ground running. And so, really the question is, how much does it cost, if we can answer it in such a simple way, to bring a drug or device to market? I don't know, Seth, if you want to kind of touch in on some of that.
Sure. And, just drug manufacturing, that's an industry in itself. And then to try to bring it into the whole picture of how clinical research has evolved, all of that, like you said, it costs money. And the amount of money that it costs to bring a drug to market, that it takes more and more money every single year. In like the average cost to bring a drug to market was $1.3 billion. And then just even in 2022, that was estimated to increase all the way up to 2.3 billion. Now there's probably like a little bit of a low point or a lull there because in 2020 there was not a lot going on, but each year we see that more and more money is being poured into, and it's because you got all these companies that are kind of racing against each other. You got companies that have similar ideas, and whoever gets their idea, if it's trying to treat the same exact thing, the one who wins the race is going to be the one who kind of takes over the market. That's at least the idea. And aside from just the cost to make the product, which goes as far as formulation, packaging, and distribution. And that all still takes place in the clinical research side too, because they have to make the drug, they have to package it and ship it out to the sites that are actually participating in the trials. And then each site, they might be required to do certain types of testing. And if they don't have that equipment, then the sponsor or the company that's paying for or carrying out the study, they might have to supply certain sites with the equipment needed to obtain the information that they need. And then on top of that, each person that's in a clinical trial, depending on how it is made up, which Tiffany, you could probably talk a little bit about that too, but there's typically some sort of reimbursement to the patients, whether it's based on the time that they spend in study visits for the trial, or gas mileage that they use to try to make it to their appointments, or even like maybe reimbursement for surgical fees, or maybe they'll just they'll cover their surgical fees if they need rescue treatment, or just maybe surgical fees in general if their insurance isn't going to pay for something that might be involved, like if it's a study that goes along with cataract surgery or cross-linking, for example. And then on top of that, they have to contract certain sites to recruit the patient or the participants and follow the participants through the entire study. And remember that some of these studies can last, up to 4 years or even more. So that's a lot of time and a lot of money that goes into every single year to try to bring a drug up to market. Each phase as we get through, whether it's phase 1, 2, 3, or 4, usually each phase requires more funding, which seems obvious because each phase, as you get higher up, has more participants and longer period of time.
Absolutely. So it's no surprise that clinical research is expensive, and it's only getting more expensive is kind of what I took away from everything that you were saying. But it also dawned on me, we're throwing around some terms here that I think it's kind of worth scaling way back and just defining. So when we talk about clinical research, I'm hearing the word sponsor, we're hearing the word site, IRB. I think it's probably worth touching in on who those are, who those players are in each clinical research. So Tiffany, can you kind of help us and what their role is? So, what's the IRB, what's their role, what are sponsors, what are their role, et cetera?
Yeah, so much like Dr. Stoffren stated earlier, the sponsor is really the owner, if you will, of the study product. They generally are responsible for conducting or at least designing and developing the clinical study. Sometimes they might hire what we call a CRO, which will help run the study at different sites. But really, the sponsor is the sole person responsible to ensure that the study data, the design, it all makes sense, so to speak, in the hopes to get it approved. So once you have a study concept, design, written research protocol, depending on the level of the study product, meaning is this a study product that is FDA approved or FDA permitted? And if it's not, then the study sponsor will apply to seek basically permission from the FDA to run the clinical study.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but I think that's worth kind of touching on, maybe not. What's the difference between FDA approved versus permitted? Is there a difference?
There is actually. And so again, this is another podcast to explain this, but really, FDA permitted clinical research studies is meaning if we're using an investigational device or an investigational drug, meaning a study product that is not FDA approved. And so sometimes we loosely will say the study is FDA approved to run using a drug or device that's not truly approved. And it's important to understand that the FDA will never approve of a new drug or device based on the study alone, meaning you have to make a deliberate attempt to apply for broader approval. And so when we run an investigational device or a new investigational drug, it's important to know the FDA permits or allows the sponsor to conduct the trial, but the product itself is not approved. And so there's a lot of regulations that goes into it. You brought up the IRB. The IRB will look to the FDA and some of their responding to allow the study to continue. So if you want to make it a hierarchical relationship, typically you start with the FDA. Again, if this is post-market, some of this stuff is not applicable, but if we're going to stick with a new drug or device example, the FDA must allow the sponsor to conduct the study. Sometimes they'll give feedback to the sponsor and make changes to the protocol. But once that has been approved, the next step is the sponsor will select its sites. Typically, clinical research sites like Vance Thompson Vision has a history of running clinical trials very well. It's important to make sure that each site generates the study data to the utmost, and it's really perfect or close to perfect as it can get, and timely. We want to make sure that when we're testing our subjects in these research studies that we're getting the data entered in an appropriate manner to, again, the sponsors in charge of safety and efficacy, and they need to closely monitor that data. So once we have an FDA allowed protocol, it goes to the IRB. The IRB is an independent ethical board that reviews every research protocol. And for protocols that are actively enrolling subjects and what we say prospectively enrolling subjects, the IRB is going to look at the entire protocol and will help us generate an informed consent for the study protocol. So the informed consent is one of the most important pieces of study paperwork that comes out of a study. Why? Because that is informing any potential research participant of all the risks and all the benefits of that study. So the IRB, again, is an independent reviewer. Their number one job is to make sure the safety of every study participant is met, meaning that the risks don't outweigh the benefits and the benefits don't outweigh the risks. It's a very equal relationship that must occur from the study protocol. And that informed consent is to basically educate that potential research subject on what the study's goals and objectives are, and asks the participant for their participation. Every subject knows that to partake in a research study, it's completely voluntary. At any time, you have the right as a research subject to decline participating, to withdraw consent, as we say, and to not go forward with study requirements. And we take that very seriously. So once you have the FDA approval protocol, once you have the IRB stamp of approval, then you can start to begin, in addition to other regulatory paperwork, you can start to begin enrolling subjects on that particular protocol.
You know, you brought up something really important, I think, and that's site selection. How would you, or maybe Seth, how would you encourage somebody or a practice, let's say if they were interested in kind of starting to raise their hand, what's a good way of trying to get involved in clinical research, or where would you go even?
Part of it is if you want to get started in research and you don't have a history of it, one of the probably most important things for it is to try to find an area that you are more passionate about, so that you can actually have the motivation and the drive. And then if it's something that you are more interested in, because the clinical research that spans across such a broad area where not only does it doesn't have to be specific to drugs or devices that are implanted. It can be something as simple as like contact lens studies, which like if you have a rep for a specific contact lens brand that visits your clinic regularly, and if you voice interest in a clinical trial to them, they'll be able to send you down the line and get you in touch with a person who can start that conversation with you.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. Kind of leaning on your connections that you have, with industry in your own clinic, and kind of understanding maybe areas of interest that they might have. And to your point, they're going to point you to somebody on their team who can help. But also, too, they know your clinic just, quite well, and so they're going to help ensure that you can deliver on some of those points that Tiffany mentioned in terms of making sure that you can meet the expectation of patient enrollment, meet the deadlines of collecting endpoints or getting to that. And so I think that's a great point, is just kind of starting right there in your office with your local connections.
Yeah. And then, beyond that, a place where there's, heavy presence of industry, like for example, in national optometry meetings, like Academy, for example, there's tons and tons of presence from industry on all different directions. And that's a huge resource to try to be able to open the door there, because you might be talking to someone who isn't necessarily involved in your region, but again, they know the person that they can get you in touch with.
Absolutely. I think too, it's important, you're the ones with boots on the ground. And if there was an idea, or somebody was seeing something clinically that they wanted to explore a little more, I think that that's also a great place to start. Just starting that conversation of, hey, I'm curious how this is impacting this, and talking with your industry partners to see, if there's anybody else out there who might have a similar thought process. And ultimately, maybe you generate your first investigator-initiated trial from that discussion, and then that gets the ball rolling for continued involvement in clinical research. And so now I think it's really important, and probably the most exciting stuff, at least for me in this podcast, is that's to kind of talk about the studies that we're currently enrolling in across all of our sites. And so Seth, I don't know if you want to kind of talk us through some of those studies.
Yeah, so we have different studies at each location throughout Vance Thompson Vision. Some of the studies are shared, just with them being multi-site. And of course, we have studies that carry over just the broad range of eye care in general, cornea-specific studies, cataract-specific studies. And right now, there's a lot of attention that's been directed towards alternative treatments for Fuchs dystrophy. For example, we finished up just in the last couple of years a study that's investigating injectable medication into the eye that can help stimulate new and healthy growth of endothelial tissue. But now we're looking at potentially an even lesser invasive treatment for that. And you can almost think of it as a topical therapy that is meant to do the same thing. It's meant to try to stimulate healthy endothelial cell growth to replace the unhealthy, non-functioning tissue that occurs in Fuchs dystrophy. And with a lot of these new treatments that are coming out, the goal, or the primary goal, is to give a patient a solution without having to rely on a cornea transplant as your one and only option. And that's something that can be extremely helpful down the road, because we have situations that are not the most common, but there's patients out there that just cannot support a corneal transplant. So then this is an entire area where it could be life-changing for somebody who needs this type of treatment. And then to keep on going down the cornea road, there's tons of research going on into epithelium on cross-linking still. Epithelium off is our kind of standard right now for cross-linking, but there's been tons of research going into epithelium on, and most people think it's the way of the future. It's just a way to stabilize keratoconus without having to subject the patients with as much blurry vision and discomfort as they would traditionally experience with epithelium off cross-linking. And then, of course, there's glaucoma studies, and that can fall into the categories of surgical and topical therapy, different topical medications to help lower eye pressure, different implants to help lower eye pressure. iDose is a hot topic right now. That's been something that's been hot, where it's just received its FDA approval, but we were involved in those studies as well.
I think that we'll have a podcast in the future kind of teasing that up, talking all things iDose. We'll probably touch on a little bit of the clinical data that came out of that, and then maybe clinical applications. So sorry to interrupt, but I wanted to throw that out there.
Sure. And I don't want to get too deep into that because, yeah, like you said, there's going to be a podcast that's specifically talking about iDose and all about it, the ins and outs. A type of study that I think all of our VTV sites are typically involved in are IOL studies, whether it's multifocal toric lenses, new lenses that are on the market, new brands, new designs to lenses. And that's always very exciting for us to be a part of, because we get our hands on the newest technology, and we're able to potentially give our patients that newer technology before anyone else is able to actually get their hands on it.
I've got a question that I can kind of piggyback on there with IOL studies. I think it's interesting. How do you talk with a patient? And maybe this is a two-part question. What's a good candidate for research? Like, how do we know that a patient outside of indication for treatment? And then two, how do you talk to that patient about being in research?
Yeah, so I would start that by, how do you select a good patient for a clinical trial? Part of it is first and foremost, they have to be a good candidate for whatever you're focusing this treatment on, so they have to have the condition that is targeted by the medication, or they, have to be a candidate for cataract surgery, and have no, safety contraindications of actually being able to proceed with surgery. So there's other aspects of it too. If in the case of glaucoma, a lot of these studies, they will be specifically looking at, mild glaucoma or maybe moderate glaucoma. So they have to fall into that specific category of severity oftentimes. And then, if we want to get into exclusions, it can be, are they taking any medications that could have known drug interactions? So for example, a lot of IOL studies, patients can't be using medications that are known to affect pupil size, because a lot of times you're using anterior segment photos to monitor the location, rotation possibly, of the IOL. And if they're taking medications that could prevent them from dilating, then you're obviously not going to get great photos to document that long term.
That's a great point. I think for me, sometimes the biggest frustration comes in that exclusion criteria when enrolling patients. Because so often there's a patient who's going to be a great candidate for a certain study that we have. They've got the condition that's being, necessary for whatever study. But then in one tiny little line in the exclusion criteria, somehow they meet that. And that can be so frustrating from a clinical standpoint. And so it's like you have to take your clinical hat off and put on your research hat to remember that these studies are, trying to look at very specific endpoints. And so if that certain exclusion is going to impact the endpoint, then they are not a good candidate for the study. But my clinician hat just really, really has a hard time letting that go.
That's a good point to make, because you'll have a study going on, you'll have a patient, and you'll want so badly for them to get in the study. And it's exactly what you said. The exclusion criteria is set for a reason. And we have to kind of follow that map to make sure that we are indeed including the intended patient base for that specific study.
That's right.
To keep going with potential exclusion criteria, oftentimes patients who have had previous ocular procedures, that can be an exclusion criteria. Accuracy of the data we might be gathering. A lot of times we're looking at, we're monitoring visual acuity afterwards. And if there's the presence of any sort of potentially progressive condition, whether it's macular degeneration or any corneal degenerative disorder, that can heavily influence the data that's gathered. So those patients, they unfortunately can't be included in a lot of these studies. And of course, there's I would call them universal exclusions that apply to pretty much most clinical trials and not just specifically in eye care. And probably the one that's going to be applied to everyone is any females specifically is if they're pregnant or nursing, because that falls into the ethical umbrella. It's not ethical to be including anyone who is pregnant or nursing in a clinical trial. And then beyond that, we get into the ideas of informed consent. And if somebody comes in and they are unable to provide informed consent, then you can't really put them in the trial. And that might have to do with cognitive features or whether or not they just are unable to consent due to their age. For example, if they're 17 years or under, technically you cannot get an informed consent. And then it depends on how the sponsor or possibly the FDA has designed that clinical trial, because sometimes if you are 17 or under, you can still partake in the trial, but you do need permission from both parents, and you may need to obtain, we call it assent, and it's not the same as consent. It's more specific to people who are underage, but in other words, the child still does have to agree to be a part of the trial, and they have to be mature enough to understand the trial and understand what they're required to do. Now, that may or may not be required. That is more dependent on the sponsor, possibly the FDA.
I think all of those are kind of great points when we're talking about, what patients are good candidates for studies. And then how does the conversation go when you find the patient who is meeting, with the chart review, some of those inclusion exclusions? How does that conversation go? Do you find patients are excited about participating in research? Do you find there's some hesitation?
Sometimes I would say that depends on personality in some ways. Sometimes the idea of research can shy somebody away. And a lot of times people will bring up a clinical trial, will explain it. And, the last thing we want is for someone to feel like they're, a guinea pig, or, that they're being tested on. And we try to describe it or present it in a way that you are going to be receiving care. And if we put a lot of emphasis on this is important because it allows us to advance medicine. And you being a part of this trial, this can help someone else down the road receive very important care if they need it. And that can become more exciting to somebody. And with more patients that I have interacted with in clinical trials, I would say that for the most part, they actually enjoy being a part of it. And it just falls into that idea that they are a part of something new and they are helping advance medicine. And I think they do find that exciting. And then beyond that, if we're talking about a patient who is a good candidate for a specific treatment, but let's say maybe they can't afford the more traditional or approved treatment that would be otherwise available, well, this is a really good way for them to actually gain access to the care that they need without having to potentially try to save up money for years while their condition is worsening. And then maybe by the time they actually can afford the treatment that they otherwise would have been required to have, that it'd just be a much more unfortunate situation if their condition has progressed and you can't take that back. So this can allow patients access to care quicker than they would otherwise have to wait for.
I think you touched on a great point. You find that patients really, yes, there are patients who are hesitant and want to make sure that, quote unquote, they aren't that guinea pig, but you do find that they are so eager to participate in something that's bigger than themselves. They're so eager to contribute to advancing medicine.
To bring on another point, and I tell all of our patients this too, as we are discussing a specific study, but not only do sponsors choose us to be a part of their study, but we kind of have to choose the study back. We have the right and we have the ability to say, no, I don't think this is a good study for us. And that might be because we don't have the specific patient population that would allow us to be good enrollers for the study. But also, if we read through the protocol of the study and we think, I don't know if I would feel great enrolling patients in this specific study, well, then we'll probably turn that one away. And it allows me to be truthful in telling our patients that we would never include ourselves in a clinical trial that I would not myself tell someone like my father to be in, if he needed it.
That's a great point and a really important point for us here at Vance Thompson Vision. So, I think it's really important. Somebody told me this once, and I think that it's really important to remember that not all patients necessarily want to participate in the clinical trial, but most patients do want a doctor that is involved in innovative research. And so maybe that isn't participating in the enrollment of a research trial or research study, or maybe it is participating in the actual enrollment of a research study. So maybe it's just kind of staying up to date on publications and research that's out there. But sometimes that can get really daunting, reading through publications and research studies. And so I think it's always helpful to kind of review what makes a good study, or when I'm reading through something, how do I know that it's a good study? Seth, do you have any specific suggestions for that?
Yeah, so I think, anytime that you're reading any sort of article, or especially like a publication, so many people, I feel like, just will glance over the abstract, or they'll just glance over the final discussion notes, and they'll read that and go, okay, I think I've taken everything that I need out of this. But it's actually really important to try to look through the guts of the study, if you will, because you can just read through that discussion, but if you don't understand exactly how that study was designed, then you might be missing certain features of it. And whoever writes the article or publishes it, they're supposed to give themselves, a fair review. But there's certain things that could, give you maybe a better understanding of what you really should take away from the article that you're reading. But even just for a brief example, the DREAM study, Dry Eye Assessment and Management, when they were looking at omega-3 supplementation for dry eye symptoms, they're specifically looking at omega-3 supplements with 400 milligrams of EPA and 200 milligrams of DHA, and they're comparing that to a placebo group. And if you just look at the results, the treatment arm, if you're grading their ocular surface disease index scores, that treatment group had a pretty significant improvement by an average of 13.9 points on their ocular surface disease index scores. And if you compare that to the placebo group, though, the placebo group also had a fairly significant improvement of 12.5 points on average. And this might raise some questions of, did the actual treatment itself work, or was it a placebo effect also in the treatment group? But then if you actually read through the study and dig a little bit deeper, that placebo group, they were receiving 1,000 milligrams of olive oil. That was their placebo. And now you can ask questions of, well, now does this pose potential for, does olive oil itself, does that cause an improvement in symptoms? You can kind of break it down a couple different ways, and it opens the door for potentially another treatment with a slightly different design, because you don't want to walk away from this saying that, well, it was the same, the treatment group was the same as the placebo group. And does that mean it didn't work? No, it doesn't mean that it didn't work. But you probably want to get more information long-term to feel a little bit more confident with, the results of the study.
Yeah, I think that's right. We can't always just take the surface level information. It's important to understand and dive deeper in the actual details of the clinical research. So I'm just going to kind of take us back to two things here. One, I wanted to touch too on studies that we enroll in from a refractive standpoint, laser standpoint. Maybe not all of our sites are always enrolling in the exact same studies, but some are enrolling in studies that are more pertinent to the care that they specialize in. And some of our sites are enrolling in, laser studies, refractive studies here and again. And one currently that I can think of is, a laser study for the treatment of hyperopia. And I'm always hesitant to get too much into detail of the specific studies that we are enrolling in, only because it constantly feels like those are changing based on enrollment goals. But I do think it's important to highlight, we always seem to be enrolling in cornea studies. We always seem to be enrolling in IOL studies, as Seth mentioned. We always seem to be enrolling in glaucoma studies. We always seem to be enrolling in corneal refractive procedures in some capacity, which is very consistent kind of with the areas of eye care that we provide. Here in Sioux Falls, maybe we'll start leaning into retina and oculoplastics, but that's to be determined. Something else that I think is really interesting from a research perspective is that cornea, you kind of touched on this because we're enrolling in a study, epithelial on cross-linking, but we were also involved in the pivotal studies that led to the FDA approval of corneal cross-linking. And if we can believe that or not, that was just in the FDA approval came in 2016. So that's not even 10 years ago. And I think cross-linking for me is one of those things that really sheds light on the importance of clinical research, because if it weren't for somebody thinking about UV light and how that could help protect the cornea from further progression, we would still be counseling patients who with cross-linking that, hey, there's nothing that we can do about this right now. We just have to watch for change. And eventually you might need a corneal transplant. And oh, by the way, you have a 50% chance of that failing after in 10 years. And so cross-linking, thankfully, we don't really have to have that conversation with patients anymore. We get to say, there's a treatment that's FDA approved that's going to help prevent that. And I just think that that's such a powerful thing to think about. And so here we are, not even 10 years later, kind of evolving that treatment yet again to ensure that efficacy is staying the same and hopefully reducing some of the risks that can be associated with that.
So Kayla, if somebody is, curious, what VTV site nearest to them is enrolling in right now as far as clinical trials, is there somewhere that they can find that?
Great question. We do. We have a portal, thompsonvision.com/OD. So please feel free at any moment to kind of look into that to see what studies that we might be enrolling in. And that's going to tell you studies across all of our sites. And don't feel that you should be limited by one site that's local or within, that's closest to you. It's not uncommon that sponsoring companies, because they are looking for, certain patients to meet enrollment, oftentimes they might reimburse for mileage. So just something to be, considering when you're counseling your patients on any potential research that they might be a candidate for.
Yeah, and I believe on that OD portal as well, it gives the contact information for some of our research coordinators at each site. So if it just comes down to, if you're looking through the study and you're even looking through that inclusion exclusion criteria that's listed up there, and if you're still unsure if your patient is a good candidate, you can always call over and discuss with one of our research coordinators, or you can even just send the patient over for a screening. The worst that can happen is we say that, no, you're not a good candidate right now, but we'll keep an eye out for something that you might be a better candidate for in the future.
Yeah, that's a great point. And honestly, being solely dedicated to research, I'm often intimidated by the inclusion exclusion criteria. And so thankfully we get to work with a great team of research coordinators who dig into that on a very deep level. And so I think that if you have a patient who you're considering, would be a candidate for research, and I would just encourage you to send them over, because that inclusion exclusion list is one to be reckoned with. So in wrapping our conversation up here, and it's been a real pleasure to talk about all things research with both of you. Seth, I think you bring tremendous experience from a clinical perspective. Tiffany, you've got fantastic regulatory perspective. And so circling it all back here, what's a study or clinical research study that you are thankful to be enrolling in current state, and anyone that's coming in the future, or maybe it's not even an enrolling study, but just something in research that we're looking forward to from the future. I'll let Tiffany kind of start.
I'm excited about cell and gene therapy in ophthalmology. I have seen what cell and gene therapy have done in other healthcare entities, so I'm really looking forward to a study right now we have at VTV that is a combination of a cell therapy and a small molecule. But furthermore, I'm excited about potentially some gene therapy clinical studies in retina.
Yeah, something that we've been involved with here in West Fargo is this is another kind of treatment for Fuchs dystrophy study, but it's called the diabetic endothelial keratoplasty study. And, we're specifically looking at the outcomes of patients who receive a endothelial transplant from a donor who had diabetes. And to be honest, we're not expecting to see any sort of issues with this study. We're not expecting to see any problems with people not being able to withhold the graft, but we're actually expecting to see positive results. And this is so important because there are tissue labs that will not harvest that endothelial cell or that endothelial graft from someone who does have diabetes. And that's very much usable tissue. And if we can prove that is safe to transplant into somebody, then that just means there's more tissue that can be harvested, and it decreases the chances of somebody needing to have to be on a wait list or anything like that for the transplant that they need.
And anything that you're looking forward to in the future?
There's been some talks about some studies that are revolving around limbal stem cell deficiency. That's exciting because that's one of those tough conditions where a lot of times you can try everything. There's no great cure. And if there's a new tool in the belt to treat that condition, then that can be extremely helpful for those really, really tough cases.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's a great point. And we're probably continuing to learn more and more about limbal stem cell deficiency. I think another area, that we're learning more and more about is neurotrophic keratitis. And anything that, is cornea involved, I think is exciting. I think it's kind of simple, but some of my favorite studies are IOL studies, mainly because we're continuing to help improve that technology. But you really also see patients who otherwise maybe wouldn't have the opportunity to experience something like that. And those studies often provide patients that opportunity. And it's, what we do. And so continuing to see that technology improve, whether it be less side effect or whether it be better outcomes from a residual refractive error standpoint, or maybe it's patients are continuing to get more and more or less and less dependent on glasses, range of vision. So, kind of a simple thing, but I think that that's very exciting. Well, we've been honored that you've spent your last hour listening to the Advanced Patient Care podcast, and hopefully we've been able to bring you the latest advancements in cutting edge research and practical tips that you can apply to your practice right away. So if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to ever reach out. And again, we'd love it if you would take the time to review our portal that goes over all of our research that we are participating in here at Vance Thompson Vision. And